screen, and we are in Acts chapter 16, verse 19. So we went up through 18 last time. So last time, just to review, all right. So last time, here's the map. So we remember that Paul is now on his second missionary journey. They decided after the council in Jerusalem to go back, deliver the news of the Council of Jerusalem's decision about the Gentiles don't have the need to become fully Jewish, become circumcised, etc. They were instructed to pass this information in Antioch and the area around there. And then Paul decided to go revisit some of the cities that they had already evangelized in the first missionary journey in South Central Asia Minor. Then the Holy Spirit directed them. They wanted to go one way. They wanted probably to go west toward Ephesus, but the Holy Spirit wouldn't allow them. They kept directing them against their own intentions, their own plan, and they end up on the northwest coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, in Troas. So you see Troas, or Troy, ancient Troy, down here on the bottom right of the screen. From there, they took, we start with these we passages that we talked about, which it seems is the Apostle Luke, the evangelist himself, joins them, and they go up to, they sail through Samothraki, this island here in the northern Aegean, which is part of modern-day Greece. They stop there for the night. They sail on to Neapolis, modern-day Kavala in Greece. And from there, that's the port city of Philippi. They go to Philippi. So right now, we're in Philippi. And Paul has taken with him Silas, as well as Timothy. And then also it seems that St. Luke is with them. So there are 4 of them that we know of in this party that arrives in Philippi. All right, so let's go back. And for the timeline, here's a little timeline of Acts. So Paul's first missionary journey seems to be around the year 47, 48. The Jerusalem Council is around 49-ish. And so now we're probably also still in the year 49, approximately. His second missionary journey. Somewhere around there, perhaps 50. All right. So in Philippi, now remember, there's no synagogue in Philippi, and Paul's modus operandi to this point is to first and foremost go to the synagogue wherever he goes and to preach to the Jews there, and by extension to Gentiles who were God-fearers, these people who are interested in Judaism but hadn't become fully Jewish. So he arrives in Philippi, and again, remember, this is not his plan. The Holy Spirit has led him here. He has this vision of the man from Macedonia calling them into Europe, calling them to Macedonia. So they sail there to Philippi, and there's no synagogue there. But instead, they ask around, and they find that the few Jews that are there meet by the riverside, which we know from other historical sources was kind of the thing that they did. When they didn't have enough for a synagogue, they met somewhere where there was water so that they could have ritual washings, and it would be considered a pure place. So they meet Lydia there. They're staying now at Lydia's house. Now, it said just before, at the end of what we covered last time, it says up here in verse 16, now it happened as we went to prayer that a certain slave girl possessed with a spirit of divination met us, who brought her masters much profit by fortune telling. And I think we started to talk about what it means there actually is, it says here, echus and pneuma pythona. So she had the spirit of the python, python, that's where we get the word python from. And it was this spirit, it's a reference to the oracle at Delphi in Greece, which was the most famous place of divination, of fortune telling. And they believed that the woman who was acting at in whatever particular point in time was acting as the oracle was possessed by this spirit of Apollo, Pythonas, the Apollo who had Apollo the god had come and slain this serpent or dragon, this evil figure called Python, at the base of the mountain there in the region of Delphi. And that the oracle was said to possess the spirit of Apollo, who had slain the evil dragon there. And so they could, by this spirit, they could tell the future. So it seems to be saying here that this girl, who was a slave girl, had something of this spirit. She was kind of maybe a cheap imitation of the oracle at Delphi, operating by the same kind of spirit, allegedly, and telling fortunes. So, and this girl followed Paul and us, and again, this is this us we passages. So probably is referring to Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke. And the girl cried out in the spirit, "These men are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation." And this she did for many days. But Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And he came out that very hour. So we talked before about this is really we see this pattern that Paul's following the same pattern as Jesus. Jesus also in his ministry, he's confronted by these people, demoniacs, etc., who recognize him for what he is. They're speaking by these spirits, and they're real spirits. The problem is that they're evil spirits. They're what we call demons. And so the same thing happens here to Paul. And so, like Jesus, he casts out the spirit, even though the spirit is telling truth in a way that they are representing the Most High God and they are bringing them the way of salvation. But the fathers say that Paul's intention here is he doesn't want to give credence to these spirits. Like in the Epistle of James, it talks about there are spirits, and even there are spirits who disguise themselves as angels, but are actually demons, and that even demons believe. Demons can know the truth, but they can't be truthful all the time. And so Paul's intention, the fathers say, is to discredit the spirit altogether, lest some of its falsehoods be believed in addition to the truth that it tells. All right, so here we're going to pick up. But 19, but when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. So this was a slave girl. They were making money off of her fortune telling. This is not something limited to our own day, palm readers, tarot readers, something along these lines, people eager to know their fortunes, what the future holds for them, and they're willing to pay for it. And the masters see that now that the spirit has been driven out of this girl, she's useless to them. She's not making them the money they were making. And so they have a case. They actually have a financial case against Paul. So they drag him to the marketplace, to the public marketplace, the agora, where the authorities would be available. 20. And they brought them to the magistrates and said, "These men, being Jews, exceedingly trouble our city, and they teach customs which are not lawful for us, being Romans, to receive or observe." So, in other words, the way they've translated the English, it's a little bit literal and stilted, but he's saying, look, these men are Jews, and they are coming here and upsetting the natural order of things here in our city. They're teaching customs which are not lawful for us, we who are Romans, to observe. So, in other words, they're implying that the Jews in the ancient Roman world, on the one hand, there were periods where there was a certain fascination with them and with their philosophy, quote unquote, their religion, some principles of the religion, the idea of monotheism. It was attractive, especially to maybe a certain elite. But there were also many people who held a prejudice against them. So, something like, remember when Kabbalah, which was this Jewish, it's an element of Judaism, Jewish mysticism, it was popular among Madonna and some Hollywood celebrities, etc., a few years ago. But then we also know the going hand in hand is that even to this day there is a great deal of Jewish racism, bigotry, etc. So the same thing in the Roman world seems to be the case, that there was a lot of distrust for them because they were so different. And the Romans, especially when it comes to the gods, they have a very different view of things. Our view in the modern Western world is very much informed by belief. What do I believe? The Roman view of religion was really more about customs and rituals and what you did in order to placate the gods. And so there was always a fear that if you didn't do these prescribed rituals and customs for the gods, they would become angry and make things difficult, go badly for your city or for you. And so there was a suspicion that the Jews, whenever maybe things would tend to go wrong, there was a famine or natural disasters or so on, that it was because the Jews were not keeping up the public's end of the bargain with the gods, which was they were to be venerated in this with these particular rituals. So this is what they're playing on, this existing prejudice against the Jews. We Romans versus those Jews over there. And they're stirring things up, causing trouble. And the end result of this is going to be that there's going to be friction and conflict here among people, and also potentially we're going to upset the gods, and things will go badly. Things will start to go wrong. So 22. Then the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates tore off their clothes and commanded them to be beaten with rods. So these magistrates, at this time, Philippi was a Roman colony, like we said before, and there were actually these magistrates in the Roman colonies there was an office called the lictors, and they actually had, as a symbol of their authority, it was a bundle of rods, a bundle of sticks or rods that were wrapped together. And sometimes there would also be a kind of axe or hatchet with them. This was a symbol of their authority. What did it mean? It meant, and actually it was called fasces et secures. Fasces is the word for this bundle of rods, and it's where we get the word fascist from, fasces, because this symbol meant, if they had this symbol, these licensed authorities, these magistrates of the colony, they had the authority to inflict corporal punishment, to use those rods. And then if the symbol also had an axe, that meant they also had the authority to execute, if necessary, to behead someone. So what's probably happening here is these magistrates had this authority to beat people, to inflict corporal punishment in order to keep peace, to keep unity. And so they command them to be beaten. Now, you notice here there's no trial. There doesn't seem to be any investigation of these charges at all. They just simply say, beat them. And it's probably because it's playing on this pre-existing prejudice they had against the Jews, and it's the multitude rose up against them, and so there's a certain fear of maybe a riot breaking out or something like that, and so they just say, beat them with rods. 23. And when they had laid many stripes on them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. Having received such a charge, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. So here we have, we talked before about when Peter was in jail, how the imagery was similar to Peter being thrown in jail, and then when he's released by an angel, almost this imagery of the resurrection out of the cave, where the stone was rolled over, where a guard was set to keep secure lest his body be stolen. So it's almost the same imagery here. They're thrown into the inner prison, which is the furthest most recess. It might even be kind of underground, a hole dug underground that you have to go through a hole in the floor to get down to this place. And so again, this imagery of the cave, of the resurrection, perhaps. Let's see. And he put them in and fastened their feet in the stocks. All right. Now notice here, what does it say? It says here it's Paul and Silas who are imprisoned. Now notice this. So there were 4 people in the party. It's Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke. Now, what do we know about Paul and Silas? Are Jewish Jews, right? But Timothy and Luke are Gentiles. Timothy, at least half Gentile, but he's raised in a Gentile world since his father was Gentile. And Luke is a Gentile God-fearer. So it's interesting that of the 4, only the 2 who look remarkably like Jews, we can assume, are the ones who are thrown in prison. The other 2 are left alone. So again, it tells us that there's this prejudice going on. All right, so now look at this. So here's an image. We get all kinds of images when it talks about them being fastened their feet in the stocks. And if you look at kind of artwork sometimes of these kind of scenes, you'll get scenes that look, like much more from the Western Middle Ages, very kind of romantic paintings, but really the stocks probably looked something like this. They would be laying down flat on the ground in prison, and it could be on their back or it could be on their stomach with their face on the ground. So they were actually laid out. They couldn't even sit up. And the stocks here had many holes in it. And the purpose of this was that the jailer, depending on his level of cruelty, could position the feet in uncomfortable positions. He could force the legs into this kind of wide posture to make it more uncomfortable if he so desired. So, it's not just, sometimes we get this image of Paul and Silas kind of sitting on the floor with their backs up against the wall. Maybe a hand is chained to the wall or something. That's probably not what it looked like. It probably looked like this, and it's in the innermost recesses of the prison where there's no windows, there's no natural light. It's just darkness. So, prison at this time was nothing like prison in our time. You can see here that they're beaten and thrown in prison with no investigation of the charges, just based on the word of a few people. And then there's no guarantee that they're going to be given water, food, allowed to get out to go to the bathroom. None of these things can be assumed. A lot of times, prisoners had to rely on the kindness of friends and family to bring them food and to bribe perhaps the guards to let them give the food or water to the prisoners. There was no necessarily limitation on how long they could be held. They may never get a trial. They just may be held there, indefinitely. I think it's Paul, when he's in Ephesus, he's in prison for 2 years in Ephesus. I mean, can you imagine being like this for 2 years? So, that's why, Paul says that he despaired of his very life. 2 years of this, it would break a person. I mean, 2 weeks could break a person, especially if there's no hope. You have no idea if you're ever going to get out. You have no rights that you know of. You can't expect anything. You can't, well, someone's working on my case, my friend. You don't know anything. You could just be there in the dark, chained to the floor without food and water, going to the bathroom for who knows how long. So it's it's a pretty dire situation. So, so that's the state they're in. We're in Philippi, and they are basically fastened to the floor. So 25. But at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. So imagine this. They are held down on this dirty prison floor without food and water or going to the bathroom. And what do? They're staying up all night in prayer. And a kind of an example of a vigil for us, of even at midnight, singing hymns and praisings to God and praying from this position. And the prisoners must have been astounded. I mean, who could imagine such a thing? Praising God while you're in this kind of predicament. 26. So that's this prayer that's going on in the middle of the night to God. This is the background against which this is going to now unfold, this great miracle. Suddenly, there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were loosed. And the keeper of the prison, awaking from sleep and seeing the prison doors open, supposing the prisoners had fled, drew his sword and was about to kill himself. But Paul called with a loud voice, saying, "Do yourself no harm, for we are all here." So imagine this: there's this earthquake. The chains are loose. The stocks that are perhaps bolted down into the ground are loosened by this shaking, and they're free. And so the earthquake, of course, wakes up the jailer. And we can tell because in the next verse it says he called for a light. Well, who did he call for it from? He must have had attendants. He must have had other people helping him. So he was sleeping while one of the attendants was on watch. But this earthquake, the sound wakes him up, and he sees that the prison doors have been busted open because of this shaking. And he assumes now that everyone's fled. So, as a Roman soldier whose job, his responsibility was to make sure that his only job was to make sure that the prisoners didn't escape. Now he's assuming that he's failed. And so, for a Roman, his first thought is to take his own life, because to avoid the dishonor and to avoid the inevitable execution that he would face for failing so miserably in his job. This would have been sadly a normal reaction of a Roman soldier. But Paul calls out in a loud voice saying, "Do yourself no harm, for we are all here." Then he, the jailer, called for light, ran in, and fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. And he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Okay, so this is that question. What must I do to be saved? This is, if we go back to the beginning of Acts in chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, Peter makes this great speech on the day of Pentecost, and the people who hear it call out to him, "What must we do to be saved?" Here, though, the context is a little bit different. It does have this nuance, and remember that the demonic spirit that was possessing this slave girl had said that these men are from the Most High God to proclaim unto you the way of salvation. But what does it mean to be saved? What must I do to be saved? What does that mean for a Roman in this time? Well, imagine the context. So the word saved really can mean throughout the Gospels, even when Jesus is speaking throughout, it means be brought to wellness, be brought to full health. Something like that. So the same way that we would say, if someone was drowning, they would say, "Save me." It doesn't mean necessarily they want someone to say, "Okay, say the sinner's prayer and then you're going to be saved." No, they literally want someone to throw a life vest or something into them and save their biological life. So it's the same here. The guy, remember, he's a Roman soldier who just a second ago thought that he had failed miserably in his lone responsibility. The prisoners had escaped. He thought he was going to be in big trouble, probably executed for dereliction of duty. He's about to kill himself as a better solution than what else would have awaited him. Then he finds that they're still there, but they're loose. And he says, "What must I do to be saved?" In other words, you could read this as, "What do I have to do to get out of this mess?" Right? How is this going to end? Are you guys going to try to overpower me and get out of here? Obviously you haven't done that yet. You've called out. You're giving me this chance, but how's this going to play out now? How do I get out of this with my life? But it could also mean that he recognizes that they are they have the aid of some great god or gods, and so he's asking them, how do I curry favor with this great God so that I no longer anger him? This is probably the mindset that a Roman soldier like him would have. So 31. So they said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household. Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night and washed their stripes. And immediately he and all his family, or all his household, were baptized. So St. John Chrysostom here says, and again, remember the focus is on the household. We've talked about this before. This idea of kind of an individual faith didn't really exist. The faith of the head of the household would determine the faith of the entire household. They were all in this together. So he takes them to his house, and it says, well, first it says that he washed their stripes. Remember, they had been beaten by the rod, so their backs were probably bloody, torn up. This was just earlier that day, and so speculation is probably there was some kind of well or spring near the courtyard around the prison. If you go to Philippi now and go to the ancient city of Philippi, you can see that the prison, it's still marked, the prison of Philippi. It was very close to, it was kind of like on the edge of the public space, of the public agora or marketplace. So there was probably some water available. So he washes their stripes. And St. John Chrysostom says on this passage, he says, look how the powerful become powerless and the powerless become powerful. And then he says, look at how he washes their stripes and then they wash him from sin. They wash his sin away in baptism. So now, he sees what good they did to him by not running away. And this is the third person in Philippi whose life is transformed by his encounter with the gospel. First was Lydia. Second was the slave girl who's exorcised of this demonic spirit. And the third is this Roman jailer who's saved from taking his own life and instead has this joyous experience. He witnesses this miracle, and then he's converted. Now he cares for them. Normally, a jailer in this period, a jailer would not be known as a humanitarian. You probably weren't selected to be a jailer at this period because of your kindness. Rather, that would be a liability for this job description. And now this man is completely transformed, that he's caring for their stripes, he's nursing them to health. And immediately he and all his family or household were baptized. Now, some people say that maybe when they're talking about household here, it could perhaps be including the attendants who are his co-workers, his underlings there at the prison. Because it's only then later now where he says he brings them to his house. So it's not clear who all is included in this, whether it's his family and these attendants as well. We don't know. 34. Now, when he had brought them into his house, he set food before them, and he rejoiced, having believed in God with all his household. All right, so now again, this theme of hospitality. So we see how Lydia, after she meets them at the riverside, insists that they enjoy her hospitality and stay with her. Now this man, having received the good news and having been converted, he insists that they enjoy his hospitality at his house and that they eat together, the sharing of a meal. All right, so 35. And when it was day, the magistrates sent the officers saying, let those men go. So the keeper of the prison reported these words to Paul, saying, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace. Now, why is it that, someone may ask, why is it that the magistrates decided to let them go? Who knows? We don't know. But it could be because they know there's really no case. And that they're hoping that they've learned their lesson and that they'll just be thankful to be released and they'll scurry out of town and not cause any more problems, which is the main concern of the magistrates in Philippi. So the jailer, now this friend and spiritual child of Paul, tells Paul and Silas, you've been let go, now therefore depart and go in peace. 37. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans, meaning we are now, Paul is emphasizing that both he and Silas enjoy Roman citizenship, which was a kind of a big deal. Remember, Paul's from Tarsus, this Roman colony. And so it seems that both he and Silas are Roman citizens, which, the magistrates, if they see that they're Jews, they would probably not assume they were Roman citizens. It wouldn't be impossible, but they just wouldn't. Their mind probably wouldn't jump to that conclusion. So now Paul's saying we're uncondemned Romans, meaning we haven't had a trial, we haven't been convicted, we're unconvicted Romans, and yet they have beat us openly and have thrown us into prison. And then he says, and now do they put us out secretly? And now they want us to just secretly just go away without causing any fuss about this? He says, no, indeed, no way. Let them come themselves and get us out. So now he's holding their feet to the fire. He says, no, they're not going to get off this easily. 38. And the officers told these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. They had overstepped their bounds. They had acted too quickly and too rashly, probably being affected by this mob, probably being affected by their own kind of maybe anti-Jewish bias. And so now they realize, we never stopped and asked if they were Roman citizens. We never stopped and asked anything. We just beat them and threw them in prison. So now they're afraid. Then they came. So then they came and pleaded with them. So these magistrates who are running the city of Philippi now actually come down to the prison area and are pleading with Paul and Silas not to make a big deal out of this. Then they came and pleaded with them and brought them out. So they themselves escort them out of prison. This kind of public statement that we were wrong, these men are innocent. We ourselves are coming to get them out of prison. So they pleaded with them and brought them out and asked them to depart from the city. 40. So they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia. And when they had seen the brethren, meaning the Christians that have the recently converted Christians, they encouraged them and departed. And so you can see here the magistrates ask them to depart from the city, and they do, but they don't do it immediately. First, they go back to the house of Lydia. They say their goodbye. They say their farewell. They speak words of encouragement to the brethren. They relate to them probably all the good things that had just happened to them, the way that God had worked in their lives. And then on their own terms, they depart the city. All right, so now we're going into 17 and going to the blessed city of Thessalonica. Any questions?
Yes, I have a question, Father.
Yeah.
What are we to assume that Timothy and Luke are still in this part of the?
Good question. So, that's kind of, so now the we drops off, right? So, now it's then they came, or that's the magistrates, but they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia. So he's talking about, it's because he's talking about Paul and Silas. Timothy and Luke has been separated from them because they were Gentiles. And so he's relating what happened to Paul and Silas in prison and with the beating, etc. But the we passage ends now. It doesn't pick up again until chapter 20. So what we think happened, one theory, and this is probably what the church has assumed, is that that Luke stays in Philippi because he doesn't accompany them anymore. But it seems that he rejoins them later in chapter 20. So it seems that they leave Luke in Philippi, and perhaps to continue building up the community there. We don't know. That's the kind of dominant theory. There's also the other theory is that, that this we isn't Luke at all, and that Luke is just using a diary that he somehow got access to of somebody else we don't know of, or perhaps of Silas or Paul or Timothy, and that's why he just moves off of the diary at this point. But the dominant theory is that Luke stays in Philippi. All right. So preaching.
Father, I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question. You say that
Oh, you muted. Jackie, you muted.
Okay, sorry. Paul goes back to Lydia, the house of Lydia, and says goodbye to Lydia. And you implied that there were converted Christians there. When did this happen?
Well, so he says when you use this term, the brethren, so entered the house of Lydia, and when they had seen the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. So that term, the brethren, is almost a technical term, meaning, tous alofous. It means, yeah, well, we know that he's just baptized, for example, the jailer and his whole household, and perhaps the attendants. So he's just baptized them. So they're at least Christian. And we can assume that Lydia has been baptized. If the jailer is baptized in such a short period of time, we can assume Lydia and perhaps the others that were meeting with her down at the riverside have been baptized and are officially Christian. But it seems just by the use of the word brethren that he's leaving a group. Maybe their precise ecclesiological status is up in the air, but we know that at least some of them have been baptized. And he encourages them and departs. So we don't really have any idea what the size of this group would have been, but it seems to be a pretty quick visit in Philippi. So who knows? But we're going to get some hints later. And then also, for example, in Philippians, Paul writes them a letter, and he talks about how they came to his aid. We're going to see here probably what happened was he goes now to Thessalonica, and he mentions in Philippians chapter 4 that the Philippians sent him aid, meaning material aid, money, food, provisions, something like that, so that he could preach in Thessalonica. So there must be some number who are loyal to him in Philippi, but we don't know how big it is. All right. So
did you suggest that Lydia had a fair amount of money?
Yeah,
I know that royal purple was expensive.
Yeah, I think it's kind of assumed that Lydia, we don't know exactly what her status was, but the guess is that she was, she could have been a freed slave. She might not necessarily have been a free person by birth. She could have been a freed slave who, however, learned the trade. And it seems that she seems to be running some kind of business involving this purple dye, probably from this madder root that they use. It was slightly less expensive than the shells of these mollusks. But the guess is that she learned this trade and that she was kind of running her own business. That might also be part of the reason that she's familiar with this area down at the river, that she used the river also for her business in some way, for washing the clothes as part of the dyeing process. But yeah, it seems that she has, and it says she invites them to her household. So it also seems that she's independent in some way. Perhaps she was never married, if she were a freed slave, or perhaps she's a widow, but she seems to be in control of a household that's big enough to accommodate 4 men and feed them. So she's probably has some means. She probably becomes the patron of this fledgling community, and perhaps it's mainly through her generosity that they're able to send something to Paul in Thessaloniki. All right, so chapter 17 now. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. So now we've reached a city big enough where there's a synagogue. All right, so let's look at this map here again. So this is northwest modern day Turkey, Asia Minor. when they had sailed over to Macedonia, this part of northern Greece. It was and still is called Macedonia. They land at Neapolis, modern day Cavallo. They go to Philippi, and then they're traveling on to Thessaloniki, which makes sense. That's the main center of Macedonia. And so they take the Via Egnatia, the famous Via Egnatia, which was a wide, famous road built by the Romans for trade purposes mainly. So from Philippi to Amphipolis, and Amphipolis today, they have discovered the remains, archaeological remains of this ancient city, but there's really not much there today. But I think it was actually not too long ago that they made some big discoveries, and I don't know that a lot of it's been published yet. So anyway, they make their way to Amphipolis, which probably was about 33 miles. So that would have been a good day's journey. And so that's probably why Paul mentions it. Probably they overnighted in Amphipolis, and then to Apollonia, which is named after Apollo, the god Apollo. That's probably about 27 miles along the Via Egnatia. Again, a day's journey. So that's probably why Luke mentions it, is that they overnight here. Now this is Halkidiki. So you have Thessaloniki here, and this is Halkidiki. In modern day, this is Mount Athos right here. This third finger, this third peninsula. This is Mount Athos. So all of this is considered Halkidiki. The beaches here are famous, and then this is a kind of mountainous area. So they go on another day's journey to Apollonia, following the Via Egnatia, and then they make their way to Thessalonica. This is about 35 miles, but this is more downhill. So again, a day's journey. All right. So pass through Amphipolis and Apollonia. They came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Now the Thessaloniki at this time, the high estimates at this time are that it had a population of 200,000, which would have been quite a bit more than the average Roman city, maybe 10 times more than an average city. So an average city might have had 20,000 people. The high estimates say 200,000. You know, a lot of times these estimates are exaggerated, but anyway, it's certainly a big city, a sizable city. And so, unsurprisingly, there are enough Jews there where they have their own synagogue. Now, in modern day Thessaloniki, there is the city is, based on the water, and then there's a hill that goes up. And the ancient city, which was founded in around 300 BC or so by the Macedonians, the ancient city was a walled city, and it was probably more on top of the hill. That the area down on the water, which is where downtown Thessaloniki really is today, probably wasn't really part of the city at that time, because they wanted that space to have as for defense against a naval invasion. So in modern Thessaloniki, if you go up the hill to the upper city, it's called, there's a monastery there, a very old monastery called Moni Vlatadon Monastery. And here there's a church, a very old church, that tradition says is built on the spot of the synagogue that was in Thessaloniki. And there, even in this church, they even have the bema where St. Paul stood, the step, the podium where St. Paul preached from in the synagogue. We're going to hear about this. So, and then also we're going to see, and it's going to come up here in a few verses, that when St. Paul is kicked out of the city, also in modern day Thessaloniki, they have just outside the walls of the ancient city, just outside, maybe a matter of a few hundred feet. As the hill goes down, there's a cave in the side of the hill where tradition says that's where St. Paul slept the night he was kicked out of the city. And so there, the cave is kind of preserved. There's a little church in there, but a very kind of simple church. And then as soon on top of that, where they could have some level ground, there's a huge church of St. Paul, dedicated to St. Paul outside the walls. And so that's the main center for St. Paul, and there's a small piece of his relics of St. Paul at this church in modern day Thessaloniki. And that part of the city is called St. Paul's. All right, so there's a synagogue in Thessaloniki. Then Paul, as his custom was, went into them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ, is the Messiah, is the one we've been waiting for. So, and again, Luke wants to make sure that we know, then Paul, as his custom was. So again, just like we saw in the first missionary journey when they go to Antioch and Pisidia, Paul makes a beeline for the synagogue. The first thing he does in every case so far is try to find the existing Jewish community. The most obvious place would be a synagogue. In the case of Philippi, where there was no synagogue, he figures out where they're meeting. So again, and it's to show that Paul by no means has abandoned the Jewish people, by no means, because he wants to show this again and again, that always he went to preach first to the Jews. It was only by, let's say, necessity that he ends up turning to the Gentiles, just as Jesus had said. You look in the Gospels, again, Jesus was clear that he came to preach to the lost house, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And it's only later that the mission, after that is tried, that the mission turns and opens up to the whole world. So Paul goes to the Sabbath, to the synagogue, and for 3 Sabbaths, so 3 Saturdays in a row, he reasons with them. So I think we've talked about this before. In these cases where there was a synagogue in the city, it's not like our modern conception of a synagogue or a church where we think of, there's a full-time rabbi or a full-time priest or pastor. That wouldn't necessarily have been the case. In fact, almost certainly would not have been the case. These were more, I guess maybe a comparison would be more like a community center, something like that. I mean, it's so, imagine these are Jews who are living outside the Holy Land. So they get together, they pool their resources. There's enough of them that they build this kind of center. And there's not this real hard and fast distinction between their religion and being Jewish, and the cultural aspects of being Jewish, cultural and religious. And this could and should sound familiar to us because we see the same thing happen in America, when the Greeks or the Russians or the Serbians or the Arabs came from their mother countries to America. They didn't have their own priests, but gradually, as they realized that they were going to be here for a while, they pooled their money and they formed community centers, basically. I believe, like in the case of Birmingham, was typical that it was funded by the Lord Byron Society. So it was not an explicitly religious gathering to begin with, but religion was part of their culture, was part of their identity that they were trying to preserve in the diaspora as a minority. So the same thing is happening here. So they don't necessarily have a professional rabbi with them. And so when someone like Paul shows up, who probably dressed as a rabbi in some way, distinguished that he was a pious and learned student of the Torah, that when he showed up at the synagogue, they probably invited him to preach, like we saw before in Antioch and Pisidia. And so it seems like likely what would have happened, he shows up at the synagogue and he's asked by kind of the equivalent of the parish council, the people who kind of run this center, this synagogue. Well, we're having our Sabbath service. Will you speak about the scripture reading? So at this time, we know that there was what we would call a lectionary. There would be an appointed reading from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as well as a reading from what we would call the prophets, from the historical and prophetic books of the Old Testament. So very similar. This is where we get our pattern of reading, one reading from the epistles, one reading from the gospel. And so they would ask him to expound on these scripture readings. So probably to happen is he goes there the first Saturday, first Sabbath. They ask him to preach. He does. He starts to explain the scriptures with reference to Christ. And then they're probably reasonable enough that they don't kick him out after the first time, that they ask him, okay, we'll hear you more on this. And he comes back a second and a third time. Now, it seems that after that, he probably stayed in Thessaloniki longer than 3 weeks, almost certainly. So after 3 weeks, it seems they probably had enough of him. And they notice here that it says that 3, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead. That was the real difficult part. I mean, not everyone necessarily was looking imminently for a Messiah figure to come, but talking about a Messiah figure certainly wouldn't have been out of the ordinary. What would have been out of the ordinary and shocking is that this Messiah figure had come, and instead of conquering the Romans and freeing the Holy Land, instead he suffered and died, and then rose from the dead. This was a very startling proposition that Paul is making. And then Paul is saying, this Jesus whom I preached to you is the Messiah, is the Christ. 4, and some of them were persuaded. So again, just like in Antioch, some of the Jews are persuaded, and this is the pattern. They preach first to the Jews, some are persuaded, but not all. The ones who don't end up making a big problem. This is the pattern. And a great multitude of the devout Greeks meaning these God-fearers, these pagans, Gentiles, Greeks who had some level of interest in the Jewish religion, and were perhaps attending the synagogue services, listening to explanations, listening to the scriptures and explanations about the Old Testament. Again, remember, this would have been read in the synagogue, would have been read in the local language. It would have been read in Greek, which is what everyone spoke. It would not have been read in Hebrew.
Isn't it interesting, Father? We're seeing that so many of those who were convinced that this was the Messiah and the message of the Messiah were mostly the non-Jewish people. And I wonder if it's because of all of the historical bonds and trappings, and perhaps they just couldn't see the trees for the forest. I don't know, or the forest for the trees. Yeah. I'm not sure. But have there been studies kind of estimating the majority of followers?
That's a good question. I don't know of any like percentages, but it seems that it's pretty quick. It's a pretty quick and surprising transition from a Jewish following to a majority Gentile church within one generation. Through the work basically of St. Paul, becomes a majority Gentile church, and that's really why the Jerusalem Council was so important, because the whole issue was kind of exploded of all these Gentiles going to become Christian. It was not something they had foreseen, but it seems to have happened very quickly. Mm-hmm. So it says here, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. And again, now it's only referring to Paul and Silas. Luke probably has been left behind in Philippi. We don't know about Timothy. Maybe Timothy stayed with Luke in Philippi, is not mentioned. And so it's interesting that not a few of the leading women. So again, there's this indication that the Christian message was particularly appealing for some reason to women. So we see this in Luke puts the most emphasis on this, because his mention in Luke 8 verses 1 through 3 about the Jewish women who are following and providing for Jesus and the disciples, and this idea that Christianity was allowing women disciples, meaning women students, women pupils. This was very unusual, not completely unique, but very unusual, especially for the Greek world. The Greek world was perhaps of all of them the most patriarchal, and so the Jewish world, all of the world was patriarchal, but the Greek world was the most patriarchal, I would say. I mean, you have Aristotle, for example, says that women, his foray into science, Aristotle says that women were malformed, were kind of birth defects, basically, that that the human person is supposed to turn out to be a male, but but in the case of females, something goes wrong, and they don't reach their full kind of maturity in the developmental phase, and so they come out as female. So this was kind of the mindset of the ancient Greek world. Women definitely had an inferior role, and so into this world you inject Christianity, where there's a surprisingly open attitude toward women participating and being disciples of Christ. A surprisingly open attitude toward all those who are kind of on the margins of society in any way. And so that's why you see a lot of these people who are on the margins are attracted to Christianity. We don't oversimplify it, and say it's just for these social reasons. That, I mean, you gotta get that impression from some academics sometimes, that it's just for these social reasons that, slaves, for example, or women are attracted to Christianity. We should assume they're attracted because of the message, and it's true. But looking at it from like a sociological point of view, it makes sense that they would be the most open, that they would have the least resistance to this kind of message. So the same with slaves, for example. This idea that this Jewish and Christian, Judeo-Christian idea that man and woman are made in the image and likeness of God. This is a revolutionary idea. I mean, that flies in the face of what Aristotle would have said. Aristotle maybe could have agreed that man, the male, was made in the image of some divine image, but not the female. The female was the imperfect, underdeveloped form. So, it makes sense here that not a few of the leading women joined, and this is a pattern that we're going to see over and over again. And so we're to take it again, like Lydia, that these are women of some means who probably end up becoming patrons of the community. And we know from other evidence historically that it was more, percentage-wise, it was more women than men who, among the Greco-Roman world, who had been interested in Judaism, who were among these kind of God-fearers who were hanging around the synagogue. Doesn't mean there were no men, but that it was more often women who were these God-fearers, and so who would have been in the synagogue to hear Paul preach this message. All right, maybe let's end there. So Paul and Silas have entered Thessaloniki. Now, at this point, we know from 1st and 2nd Thessalonians that Paul sets, it seems anyway, that Paul sets up shop probably in the marketplace, the Agora, which, the ancient Agora of Thessaloniki is still preserved. It's right in the middle of hustling, bustling downtown Thessaloniki, this archaeological site. So, and it was probably there that Paul sets up shop. A lot of people assume that he worked as a tent maker based in all these cases. And so it's assumed that he probably set up shop in the Agora, was working as a tent maker. He says I think it's 1st Thessalonians, he says that he worked day and night among them so that he wouldn't be a burden to them. And then he mentions in Philippians how the Philippians had sent him some aid while he was getting started. So we had, Philippi was 100 miles away. So for Paul to stay there long enough to get word back to Philippi that he was in Thessaloniki, that he maybe would appreciate some aid, by the time it gets there, by the time he's able to set up shop and do some work, he's got to be there a certain amount of time. This isn't like Philippi where he's there a matter of days probably, or 1 or 2 weeks. So we'll see how it turns out here in Thessaloniki. But so St. Paul, there's, like I said, there's several places you can visit in Thessaloniki that are tied with St. Paul, particularly the alleged site of the synagogue, and then the site where he was expelled from Thessaloniki, although we haven't gotten there yet. And then we're going to learn that he's hosted by this Jason. And the location of Jason's house, I don't recall ever hearing anything about that in Thessaloniki. I'd have to ask if there is any kind of speculation where that might have been. But presumably it would have been in the upper part of the city. Anybody here been to Thessaloniki, perhaps with Father Paul on one of his trips? Yeah.
We visited with some friends of ours there for about a week. Yeah, I just love the city.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. It's a great.
Father, isn't it true that your children were born there?
Yeah.
Were your kids born there?
The triplets
Your
were born in
triplets?
Thessaloniki. Yeah. The little one, Dami, she was born in Volos, about 2.5 hours south. So yeah, so Thessaloniki. So again, for the timeline here, we think that we're talking about the year 49, perhaps that Paul and Silas enter Thessaloniki. And then the interesting thing is First Thessalonians, Paul's first letter to the people of Thessaloniki, is of all the documents, of all the texts there in the New Testament, there are 27 different books or texts in the New Testament. Thessalonians is considered the oldest, probably. Some people, yeah, there is an argument for Galatians being maybe slightly earlier, but usually the consensus is that it's First Thessalonians, and that was written in 49 AD. And the interesting thing here is that it's actually probably written, First Thessalonians is probably written only a matter of some weeks after he's kicked out of Thessaloniki. So it's a letter preserved from pretty soon after his initial contact and his building up of this Christian community in Thessaloniki. So that's interesting. Some of the other letters, perhaps it's been some years since he's seen them. So, all right. So we'll pick up at 17:05 next time. Anybody have any last questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
I bet you have an extra special feeling when you read the Thessalonian verse. Any mention of it, because it would be, since you lived there, you had such a wonderful experience, I'm sure. So
yeah, and you think about there's this one place, it's an underground crypt in the city. It's underneath a modern church, but there's some speculation that that's where the Christians may have met in the first century. There's no way to know, but you think about it being such an early Christian community. There was this article actually, when was it? Maybe a year or so ago. It was this Protestant pastor, one of these young hipster pastors, and he was talking about how this church that he built, he founded, he created it, and now he was gonna move on, and it was gonna close or something. And he said, he was claiming like divine inspiration for this, and saying that he's like, well, he said, quote, none of the churches the apostles founded are still with us. So and so there are all these Orthodox who are like, here's the bishop of Thessaloniki, and there's who's in this line of succession since 49 AD. So try again, buddy. So there is something special about thinking that there's been a continuous living Christian community there, unbroken since 49 AD. So yeah, it's a special place.
It is.
Father, when we were doing name days for St. Demetrius, I think I read that anyone born in Thessaloniki, that person's patron saint is St. Dimitri. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, maybe you could.
Seriously.
Maybe you could say that. Well, he's certainly the patron saint of the city.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you could, in a way, you could say that. Yeah, that he protects the city and he protects the inhabitants of the city. There's definitely a very special and close relationship with Saint Demetrius. I mean, it's considered no one would insult his memory. I mean, he's the one who runs Thessaloniki. So like on his feast day, that's it's like it's a regional holiday. So everything's closed in Thessaloniki. Not necessarily, not in Athens, but in Thessaloniki, forget about it. Everything's closed. So, yeah, and there's a story from St. Paisios that the main street, well, one of the main streets in Thessaloniki, is called St. Demetrios Street because it's the street that his church is on. It also happens to be the same street that the house where Kemal Ataturk was born. So Kemal Ataturk was actually born in Thessaloniki, the one who founded the modern Turkish Republic. And it's probably, I don't know, a mile or two down the road from St. Demetrios, but the same road. And today it's the location of the Turkish consulate in Thessaloniki. And there was a move some years ago while St. Paisios was still alive, so 80s or 90s, some idiot politician proposed renaming the street of St. Demetrios to Kemal Ataturk Street.
Oh,
There was a huge outrage. People, there were apparently like hundreds of thousands of people, took to the streets protesting this. And it says St. Paisios himself came off Mount Athos to join the protest on the street, Thessaloniki. So that didn't, I met people who actually, remember that. So needless to say, that politician's great idea did not succeed. It's still St. Demetrios.
wow.
All right. Well,